The Mississippi Delta in August of 1995 was no place for the unprepared. When the summer storms descended from the Gulf of Mexico, they brought with them a humidity so thick it could choke the breath from your lungs and turn the rich bottomland into a steaming cauldron of heat and moisture. For those who had learned to read the signs, the storm clouds gathering over the cotton fields that particular evening promised to bring more than just rain. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this tale of courage and discovery touches your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got another amazing story that will blow your mind. Becca Morrison stood on the wraparound porch of Willowbrook Plantation, watching dark clouds build over the endless rows of abandoned cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon. At 42, she had spent the last 3 months trying to make sense of the inheritance that had completely upended her carefully ordered life in Chicago. The sprawling antebellum mansion with its 23 rooms and crumbling grandeur had belonged to her great-aunt Cordelia, a woman she had met only twice in her entire life. The inheritance had come at the worst possible time. Becca's 15-year-old son, Marcus, was struggling with anger issues stemming from his father's abandonment 2 years earlier, and her job as a social worker barely covered their modest apartment rent, let alone the massive restoration costs that Willowbrook demanded. She had come south with the intention of selling the property as quickly as possible and returning to the familiar struggles of urban life. But the plantation had secrets that seemed determined to keep her longer than planned. The heat was becoming unbearable, even for someone who had grown up enduring Chicago summers. Becca pulled her cotton blouse away from her skin and moved toward the relative coolness of the mansion's interior, where 14-foot ceilings and thick walls provided some relief from the oppressive temperature. The house groaned and settled around her, its aged timbers responding to the changing atmospheric pressure with sounds that seemed almost human in their complexity. Willowbrook had been built in 1847 by her ancestor, plantation owner Jeremiah Morrison, using architectural techniques that reflected both Southern grandeur and practical considerations for surviving Mississippi's brutal climate. The mansion featured a central hallway designed to funnel cooling breezes through the house, double galleries that provided shade and circulation, and massive windows that could be opened to create cross-ventilation during the sweltering summer months. Her nearest neighbors, the Patterson family, lived 4 miles to the east in a modern ranch house that seemed to represent everything Willowbrook was not: efficient, practical, and manageable. They had been polite but distant during her brief encounters with them at the local grocery store, treating her with the careful courtesy that small Southern communities reserved for outsiders who might not understand local customs and expectations. The isolation that had once seemed romantic when she first arrived now pressed against her like the humid air itself. She had grown accustomed to the constant noise and activity of Chicago, where neighbors were close enough to hear through thin walls, and the city never truly slept. Here the silence was profound and sometimes unsettling, broken only by the sounds of insects, distant thunder, and the occasional cry of night birds she couldn't identify. Becca moved through her evening routine with practiced efficiency, checking the windows and doors of the massive house, adjusting the few working ceiling fans, and preparing a simple dinner in the kitchen that still featured the original cast-iron stove alongside modern appliances that had been added over the decades. The kitchen was her favorite room in the house, with its warm brick floors, exposed beam ceiling, and walls lined with shelves that still held mason jars filled with preserves that Aunt Cordelia had made years before her death. The plantation itself was a study in faded grandeur and missed opportunities. The main house consisted of 4 levels, if you counted the basement and attic, a ground floor with formal parlors, dining room, library, and kitchen, a second floor with 6 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, a third floor that had once housed servants and later been converted to storage, and a basement that ran the full length of the house and contained wine cellars, root cellars, and mysterious rooms whose original purposes were no longer clear. Outside, the grounds told the story of a property that had seen both prosperity and decline. Magnificent live oak trees draped with Spanish moss created natural galleries and shaded areas where generations of Morrison family members had gathered for celebrations and daily life. The formal gardens that had once been the pride of the plantation were now overgrown with native vegetation, though the underlying structure of pathways, fountains, and ornamental plantings could still be discerned by someone with imagination and patience. Becca's life had taken turns she never could have anticipated. Born Rebecca Ann Kowalski in Chicago to Polish immigrants, she had been raised with expectations of hard work, education, and gradual advancement within the familiar confines of the city's ethnic neighborhoods. Instead, she had fallen in love with David Morrison during college, a charming journalism student who claimed distant Southern connections but seemed more interested in urban sophistication than family history. Their marriage had produced Marcus, and several years of reasonable happiness before David's wandering eye and inability to handle domestic responsibilities led to increasingly frequent absences and eventual abandonment. Becca had rebuilt her life around single parenthood and social work, creating a stable, if modest, existence that centered on helping troubled families navigate Chicago's complex social services system. The discovery that she was related to Mississippi plantation owners had come as a complete shock. David's family connections, which he had always described vaguely as old Southern stock, turned out to include direct lineage to the Morrison family that had owned Willowbrook for over a century. When Aunt Cordelia died at 91 without direct descendants, genealogical research had traced the inheritance through David's abandoned family line directly to Marcus, with Becca serving as guardian of the property until her son reached majority. The work of assessing and maintaining the plantation was demanding and sometimes overwhelming. The house needed extensive repairs to plumbing, electrical systems, and structural elements that had been neglected during Aunt Cordelia's final years. The grounds required constant attention to prevent the aggressive Mississippi vegetation from reclaiming cultivated areas. Most challenging of all, the property taxes and insurance costs were far beyond anything Becca could afford on her social worker's salary. She had learned to repair broken shutters, replace rotted porch boards, and maintain the complex system of gutters and drainage that kept the old house from succumbing to water damage. Her hands had grown calloused and strong from wielding tools she had never touched in Chicago, and her skin had darkened from hours spent working in the intense southern sun. The physical labor was exhausting, but also strangely satisfying, connecting her to generations of women who had maintained homes and families under much more difficult circumstances. The relationship with the local African-American community was complicated and largely unspoken. Willowbrook's history as a cotton plantation meant that many local families had ancestors who had been enslaved on the property, a legacy that created undertones of tension and awkwardness in even the most routine interactions. Becca's efforts to be respectful and acknowledge the plantation's difficult past were met with polite but guarded responses from African-American residents who had learned to be cautious about white people expressing sudden interest in historical reconciliation. She had attempted to research the plantation's history through local historical societies and libraries, but much of the documentation from the Civil War era had been lost or deliberately destroyed in the chaos that followed Confederate defeat. What remained painted a picture of a moderately prosperous plantation that had survived the war years through careful management and strategic alliances, though the specific details of how the Morrison family had navigated those turbulent times remained frustratingly vague. Now, as the storm outside reached its full intensity, rattling the tall windows and sending rain in sheets across the wide front porch, Becca found herself drawn once again to the plantation's most mysterious room, the library that had been Jeremiah Morrison's private study. The room occupied a corner of the ground floor and featured floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with volumes on agriculture, law, literature, and history that dated back to the mid-19th century. She had spent hours in that room during her first weeks at Willowbrook, reading through family papers and trying to understand the world that her son had inadvertently inherited. Most of the documents were routine business correspondence, property records, and personal letters that revealed the daily concerns of a plantation family navigating the economic and social challenges of the antebellum and Reconstruction periods. But tonight, as thunder crashed overhead and lightning illuminated the room in stark flashes of white light, something about the space felt different. Perhaps it was the way the storm's electrical energy seemed to make everything more vivid and immediate. Or perhaps it was simply the accumulated effect of months spent absorbing the plantation's complex history. But Becca found herself noticing details that had previously escaped her attention. The desk that dominated the center of the room was a massive piece of mahogany furniture that had obviously been built to last for generations. Its numerous drawers and compartments had yielded various papers and artifacts during her earlier searches, but she had never examined it with the thoroughness that such a substantial piece of furniture deserved. Tonight, driven by restlessness and the inability to sleep through the storm's fury, she decided to conduct a more systematic exploration of its secrets. Most of the drawers opened easily and contained the expected assortment of old pens, paper, clips, rubber bands, and miscellaneous office supplies that accumulate in any working desk over decades of use. But the large bottom drawer on the right side seemed to stick, as though something was preventing it from opening completely. Becca pulled harder, thinking that humidity or warped wood was causing the problem. But the drawer remained stubbornly resistant to her efforts. Closer examination revealed that the drawer was actually shorter than it appeared from the outside, suggesting the presence of a hidden compartment behind the visible storage space. The discovery sent a thrill of excitement through her as she realized that she might have found one of the secret hiding places that wealthy Southern families had commonly built into their homes during the uncertain years of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Using a flashlight to examine the interior of the drawer more carefully, Becca found a small wooden lever hidden along the back edge that, when pressed, caused a panel to swing open and reveal a narrow compartment that ran the full width of the desk. The space contained several items that had obviously been placed there for safekeeping. A small, leather-bound journal, a collection of gold coins wrapped in oiled cloth, and most intriguingly, a rolled parchment tied with a faded red ribbon. The journal proved to contain personal observations and reflections written by Becca Morrison during the final years of the Civil War. But it was the parchment that captured Becca's complete attention. When carefully unrolled, it revealed a hand-drawn map of the Willowbrook property and surrounding area, complete with topographical details, landmark notations, and a series of cryptic symbols that seemed to mark specific locations throughout. The plantation grounds. At the bottom of the map, written in the same careful handwriting that filled the journal, were the words, "For the preservation of Southern honor and the future security of the Morrison family legacy, may God preserve what righteous men have earned through honest labor." The notation was signed General J. Morrison, CSA, and dated April 1865, just days before Confederate surrender at Appomattox. The revelation that her ancestor had held the rank of general in the Confederate Army came as a shock to Becca, who had assumed that Jeremiah Morrison was simply a civilian plantation owner who had survived the war through political neutrality. The discovery raised disturbing questions about her family's involvement in the Confederate cause, and the extent to which Willowbrook's prosperity had been built on the systematic exploitation of enslaved labor. But it was the map itself that truly captured her imagination and concern. The symbols marked throughout the property clearly indicated buried caches of some kind, with notations suggesting quantities and locations that implied a treasure of significant value. If the map was authentic, and if the items it marked had survived undiscovered for over a century, Becca might have stumbled upon something that could transform not only her own financial situation, but potentially impact the entire local community. Storm continued to rage outside, as though nature itself was responding to the momentous discovery taking place within the old plantation house. As Becca sat in the flickering candlelight, studying the mysterious map and trying to comprehend its implications, she realized that her quiet summer of property assessment had suddenly become something far more complex and potentially dangerous than anything she had imagined when she first arrived in Mississippi. The woman who had come south with the simple intention of settling an inheritance and returning to Chicago now faced choices that could affect not only her own future and that of her son, but potentially the lives of everyone in the surrounding community who still carried the complex legacy of the Civil War and its aftermath. Becca Morrison sat at the mahogany desk as dawn broke slowly over the Mississippi Delta. The mysterious map spread before her like a puzzle demanding to be solved. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind the clean, washed smell of rain and earth that seemed to make everything more vivid in the early morning light. She had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about what she had discovered and what it might mean for her carefully planned future. At 42, Rebecca had built her life around predictability and careful planning. After David's abandonment, she had learned to rely entirely on herself, creating routines and systems that protected both her and Marcus from the chaos that seemed to follow broken families. Her work as a social worker in Chicago's South Side had taught her to recognize the warning signs of families in crisis, and she had applied those same skills to managing her own household with methodical precision. Born Rebecca Ann Kowalski, she had grown up in a working-class Polish neighborhood where success was measured in steady employment, home ownership, and children who stayed out of trouble. Her parents, Stefan and Maria Kowalski, had immigrated to America in the 1940s with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone around them. They had built a small construction business that specialized in home renovation, teaching Rebecca the value of honest labor and careful attention to detail. The neighborhood of her childhood had been a tight-knit community where everyone knew their neighbor's business and looked out for each other's children. Mrs. Kowalski had run an informal daycare from her kitchen, while Mr. Kowalski had taught neighborhood boys basic carpentry and electrical work in the garage behind their modest two-story house. Rebecca had absorbed lessons about community responsibility and mutual support that would later influence her choice to become a social worker. Her academic abilities had earned her a scholarship to Northwestern University, where she had studied psychology and social work with the intention of returning to help families in her own community. Instead, she had met David Morrison during her junior year, a charismatic journalism major whose easy charm and stories about Southern heritage had seemed romantic and exotic to a young woman who had never traveled beyond the Midwest. David had claimed connections to old Mississippi families, but had always been vague about the details, describing his background in terms that suggested genteel poverty rather than the substantial plantation ownership that she was now discovering. His family history had apparently been a source of embarrassment rather than pride, something to be minimized rather than explored. He had shown more interest in urban sophistication and media careers than in understanding his ancestral roots. Their marriage in 1978 had been a modest affair held in the Catholic Church where Rebecca had been baptized, with a reception in the parish hall that reflected her family's practical approach to celebrations. David's family had attended but had remained distant and formal, treating the wedding as an obligation rather than a celebration. Looking back, Rebecca could see signs of the disconnection that would eventually destroy their marriage. But at the time, she had attributed their reserve to cultural differences between Southern and Northern family traditions. The early years of marriage had been reasonably happy, with David working as a reporter for various Chicago newspapers, while Rebecca established herself in the city's social services system. They had bought a small house in a transitional neighborhood, planning to renovate it gradually as their financial situation improved. Marcus had been born in 1980, a healthy, intelligent child who seemed to inherit his father's charm and his mother's determination. But David's journalism career had never achieved the success he had expected, and his response to professional disappointment had been to seek escape through increasingly frequent absences from home. He had claimed to be pursuing important stories or investigating leads that required travel, but Rebecca had gradually realized that these trips were actually attempts to avoid the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage. His departure in 1993 had been sudden but not entirely unexpected, leaving behind debts, broken promises, and a teenage son who struggled to understand why his father had chosen career ambitions over family loyalty. The years of single parenthood that followed had been challenging but also empowering. Rebecca had discovered reserves of strength and capability that she hadn't known she possessed, managing household finances, home maintenance, and Marcus's increasingly complex emotional needs, while maintaining her demanding career in social work. She had learned to repair plumbing, negotiate with landlords, and advocate for her son's educational needs with the same determination her parents had shown in building their construction business. Her work with troubled families had given her insights into the long-term effects of abandonment and instability on children's development. She had seen too many cases where fathers' departures had led to cycles of anger, academic failure, and destructive behavior that could persist for generations. Her determination to prevent Marcus from following such patterns had shaped every decision she made about their lives together. Marcus, at 15, was a complex young man who combined his father's natural charm with an underlying anger that manifested in conflicts with teachers, occasional fights with classmates, and a general resistance to authority that worried Rebecca deeply. He was intelligent enough to excel academically when he chose to apply himself, but his grades had become increasingly erratic as he struggled with questions about his identity and place in the world. The discovery of his connection to Willowbrook Plantation had initially seemed like a potential positive development, offering Marcus a sense of family history and belonging that might help stabilize his emotional life. Rebecca had hoped that learning about his Southern heritage might provide the kind of grounding and identity that could channel his energy in more constructive directions. The reality of inheriting a deteriorating plantation with a complex and potentially disturbing history had proven far more complicated than she had anticipated. The plantation itself represented everything that Rebecca's working-class background had taught her to view with suspicion. The massive house, with its unused rooms and ornate details, seemed like a monument to inequality and waste, while the agricultural land that surrounded it carried the unmistakable legacy of wealth built on enslaved labor. Her social work experience had made her acutely aware of how historical injustices continued to affect contemporary communities, and she felt uncomfortable about potentially profiting from property that represented such a problematic past. Yet the practical realities of her financial situation made it impossible to simply walk away from the inheritance. Marcus would need college tuition within a few years, and Rebecca's modest social worker salary would never be sufficient to provide him with the opportunities that could help him build a successful life. The plantation, despite its troubling history, represented the kind of generational wealth that could transform their family's prospects if it could be managed responsibly. The map she had discovered added an entirely new dimension to these already complex considerations. If the symbols and notations were accurate, and if the items they marked had survived undiscovered for over a century, she might be sitting on a treasure that could solve all of her family's financial problems. But the map also raised disturbing questions about how such wealth had been accumulated and hidden, and what moral obligations she might have to communities that had suffered under the plantation system. General J. Morrison's journal, which she had begun reading carefully in the early morning hours, painted a picture of a man who had viewed the Civil War as a struggle for Southern independence and states' rights rather than as a conflict over slavery. His writings revealed someone who considered himself a patriot, defending his homeland against Northern aggression, but who also clearly understood that defeat would mean the end of the economic system that had supported Southern prosperity. Journal entries from the final months of the war showed increasing desperation as Confederate forces faced inevitable defeat. Morrison had written extensively about his efforts to preserve what he called the fruits of honest Southern enterprise for future generations of his family. He had described converting liquid assets into gold and other portable valuables, and had made cryptic references to securing the future through careful planning and strategic concealment. Most disturbing to Rebecca were the journal entries that revealed Morrison's attitudes toward the enslaved people who had worked on his plantation. While he wrote about them with what he apparently considered benevolent concern, his words revealed a fundamental inability to recognize their humanity or acknowledge the injustice of their bondage. He had viewed slavery as a natural and beneficial institution that provided care and guidance for people he considered incapable of self-governance, and he had genuinely believed that he was fulfilling a Christian duty by maintaining what he saw as a paternalistic relationship with his enslaved workers. The disconnect between Morrison's self-image as an honorable Christian gentleman and the reality of his participation in human trafficking and forced labor was so profound that Rebecca found herself struggling to understand how intelligent people could have maintained such moral blindness. Her social work experience had taught her to recognize the psychological mechanisms that allowed people to justify harmful behavior. But the scale and systematic nature of slavery's horrors made Morrison's rationalizations particularly difficult to comprehend. As she continued reading through the journal, she began to understand that the map represented more than just hidden treasure. It was Morrison's attempt to preserve not only wealth, but also what he saw as the honor and legacy of the Southern cause. The locations marked on the map were not randomly chosen hiding places, but were connected to specific landmarks and family memories that held deep meaning for the Morrison family history. One cluster of symbols appeared to mark locations near the slave quarters that had once housed the plantation's workforce. Another group of markings indicated spots near the family cemetery, where generations of Morrisons were buried beneath elaborate marble monuments. A third set of symbols seemed to correspond to areas along the property's boundaries where Morrison had apparently hidden caches intended to fund what he described as the eventual restoration of righteous government. The implications of these locations were deeply troubling to Rebecca. If Morrison had buried treasure near the slave quarters, it seemed likely that enslaved people had been forced to participate in the concealment, potentially under threat of violence if they revealed the locations. The idea that wealth accumulated through forced labor had been hidden by the very people whose unpaid work had created it added another layer of moral complexity to her discovery. The markings near the family cemetery suggested that Morrison had viewed his treasure hiding as connected to his obligations to dead ancestors and future descendants. His journal contained several references to promises made to his father and grandfather about preserving the family's honor and financial security, regardless of political changes or military defeats. The treasure represented not just personal wealth, but also a sacred trust that connected past and future generations of the Morrison family. Perhaps most concerning were the references to funding the eventual restoration of righteous government. These notations suggested that Morrison had hidden wealth with the intention of supporting future attempts to restore Confederate political control or resist federal authority during Reconstruction. The treasure map was not just a family inheritance, but potentially a document connected to violent resistance against civil rights and federal law enforcement. As the morning progressed and Rebecca continued to study both the map and the journal, she began to realize that her discovery had implications far beyond her own family's financial situation. The treasure, if it existed and could be recovered, represented wealth that had been stolen from the community through the unpaid labor of enslaved people. Any decision about what to do with such wealth would need to consider not only her own family's needs, but also the moral claims of descendants of the people whose work had created it. The sun was now fully risen, casting long shadows across the plantation grounds and illuminating the landscape that Morrison's map had so carefully documented. Rebecca could see from her window many of the landmarks that appeared on the parchment: the ancient live oak trees, the remains of outbuildings, the gentle hills and seasonal creek beds that had provided reference points for Morrison's careful measurements and notations. She realized that she was facing a decision that would define not only her own future, but also her relationship with the complex legacy of American history. The map in her hands was more than just a guide to hidden treasure. It was a test of her character and values that would reveal whether she could find a way to acknowledge historical injustices while still providing for her son's future. The woman, who had come to Mississippi with the simple intention of settling an inheritance, now understood that she had stumbled into the middle of unfinished business that connected the Civil War era to contemporary struggles over memory, justice, and community healing. Rebecca spent the following days immersed in research that painted an increasingly complex picture of both her family's past and the current dynamics of Magnolia County, Mississippi. The local library in nearby Hattiesburg contained extensive archives about Civil War history, but she quickly discovered that the story of race relations in the area was far from being ancient history. Current tensions simmered just beneath the surface of everyday interactions, making her discovery of Morrison's treasure map not just a personal dilemma, but a potential catalyst for community conflict. The librarian, Mrs. Dorothy Hendricks, was an elderly white woman whose family had lived in the county for 5 generations. She proved to be a wealth of information about local history, but her perspective revealed the same kind of romanticized view of the antebellum period that Rebecca was beginning to recognize as a common feature of white Southern historical memory. Mrs. Hendricks spoke fondly of the gracious plantation lifestyle and the mutual affection between plantation owners and their enslaved workers. Descriptions that made Rebecca increasingly uncomfortable as she learned more about the brutal realities of forced labor. Through Mrs. Hendricks, Rebecca learned that Willowbrook had been one of the more prosperous plantations in the county, with over 200 enslaved people working its cotton fields at the peak of production in the 1850s. General Morrison had apparently been respected as a relatively benevolent owner who provided adequate food and shelter for his workforce, but the library's records also contained documents about runaway slaves, punishment records, and slave sales that revealed the violence inherent in even the most humane slavery operations. More troubling was Mrs. Hendricks's casual mention that many local African-American families could trace their ancestry back to Willowbrook's enslaved population. The descendants of people who had been forced to work Morrison's land still lived in the area, many of them struggling with poverty and limited economic opportunities that seemed directly connected to the historical legacy of slavery and subsequent decades of legal discrimination. The contrast between the wealth that Morrison had been able to accumulate and hide and the continuing economic disadvantages faced by descendants of the people whose labor had created that wealth struck Rebecca as a profound injustice that her discovery had the potential to either perpetuate or address. The map in her possession represented not just hidden treasure, but blood money that carried moral obligations she was only beginning to understand. Her research also revealed that Magnolia County had been a hotbed of white resistance during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Several local African-American activists had been murdered or driven from the area, and the county had been one of the last in Mississippi to comply with federal desegregation orders. While overt violence had decreased since the 1970s, economic disparities and social segregation remained deeply entrenched, with most white and black families living essentially separate lives despite sharing the same geographic community. The current economic situation added another layer of complexity to Rebecca's moral calculations. The county had never fully recovered from the decline of agriculture and the closure of several manufacturing plants during the 1980s. Unemployment was high among both white and black residents, but African-American families faced additional barriers, including limited access to business capital, inferior educational opportunities, and ongoing discrimination in hiring and promotion practices. At the same time, Rebecca was becoming acutely aware of the financial pressures that made it difficult for her to simply ignore the potential value of Morrison's hidden treasure. Her savings account was rapidly depleting as she covered the costs of maintaining Willowbrook, and her leave of absence from her Chicago social work position would end within 2 months. Marcus would be starting his junior year of high school, and she needed to make decisions about college preparation that would determine his future opportunities. The house itself was proving to be a constant drain on her limited resources. The roof needed extensive repairs that would cost at least $15,000, and the electrical system was so outdated that it posed genuine safety hazards. The property taxes alone were more than she could afford on her current income, and selling the plantation would require significant investments in renovation and maintenance before it could attract serious buyers. Marcus had been surprisingly enthusiastic about spending the summer in Mississippi, finding in the plantation grounds the kind of adventure and independence that urban Chicago had never provided. He had spent hours exploring the outbuildings, fishing in the creek that ran through the property, and learning to identify the various plants and animals that flourished in the subtropical environment. For the first time since his father's departure, he seemed genuinely happy and engaged with his surroundings, but Rebecca had also noticed troubling signs that suggested Marcus was not immune to the racial tensions that permeated local culture. He had made friends with several white teenagers from nearby farms, and she had overheard conversations that included casual racist language and attitudes that reflected the same kind of historical blindness she was encountering among older white residents. The influence of peer pressure and social conformity was clearly affecting his developing sense of identity in ways that concerned her deeply. The African-American community in Magnolia County centered around Mount Olive Baptist Church, a congregation that had been founded by former slaves in the years immediately following the Civil War. The church served not only as a place of worship, but also as a community center, meeting place, and anchor for cultural traditions that had survived both slavery and the subsequent century of legal discrimination. Rebecca had attended one Sunday service at Mount Olive, hoping to better understand the community that had been most affected by her ancestors' actions. The experience had been both welcoming and challenging, as she found herself warmly received as a visitor while simultaneously aware that her presence represented the continuing legacy of historical injustices that the congregation and their ancestors had endured. The pastor, Reverend Samuel Washington, was a man in his 60s whose grandfather had been born into slavery on a plantation just 20 miles from Willowbrook. His sermon that Sunday had focused on forgiveness and reconciliation, but Rebecca could sense undercurrents of anger and frustration that reflected the community's ongoing struggles with poverty and discrimination. After the service, several church members had approached her with polite curiosity about her plans for the Morrison property, questions that seemed to carry deeper concerns about how her presence might affect their community. Through these conversations, Rebecca learned that many local African-American families had stories and oral traditions about buried treasure and hidden wealth that plantation owners had concealed during the Civil War. These stories were generally dismissed by white historians as folklore or wishful thinking, but Rebecca was beginning to understand that they might represent genuine historical memories passed down through generations of people who had been forced to participate in hiding the very wealth that their unpaid labor had created. One elderly church member, Mrs. Josephine Turner, whose great-grandmother had been enslaved at Willowbrook, shared family stories about nighttime digging operations that had required slave labor under armed guard. According to these oral histories, enslaved people had been forced to bury containers of gold and silver in locations throughout the plantation, then threatened with death if they revealed the hiding places to Union forces or federal authorities. During Reconstruction, Mrs. Turner's stories closely matched the locations and symbols that Rebecca had found on Morrison's map, lending credibility to both the treasure's existence and the likelihood that its concealment had involved the forced participation of enslaved people. The moral implications of this connection were staggering. Morrison had not only used unpaid slave labor to accumulate wealth, but had then forced those same people to hide the evidence of their exploitation while threatening them with violence. If they sought to claim any portion of what they had created, the weight of this knowledge was becoming almost unbearable for Rebecca, who found herself caught between her son's financial needs and her growing understanding of the injustices that her family's inheritance represented. Every dollar that Morrison had buried had been earned through the systematic brutalization of human beings who had been denied any opportunity to benefit from their own labor. The treasure map was not just a guide to hidden wealth, but a document that recorded one of the most profound moral crimes in American history. Yet walking away from the treasure would not undo the historical injustices or provide any benefit to the descendants of enslaved people who continue to struggle with the economic legacy of slavery. Rebecca began to wonder whether there might be a way to use her discovery to address rather than perpetuate the inequalities that slavery had created. But she had no clear idea how such an approach might work in practical terms. The legal implications of her situation were also becoming clearer as she consulted with attorneys about her inheritance. Mississippi law regarding found treasure was complex and potentially favorable to property owners. But federal regulations about historical artifacts and sites could complicate any recovery efforts. More importantly, if the treasure had been hidden with the intention of funding resistance to federal authority, its recovery might trigger investigations that could expose her family to criminal liability under laws governing sedition and tax evasion. The practical challenges of actually locating and recovering the treasure were equally daunting. Morrison's map was over 130 years old, and the landscape had changed significantly since the 1860s. Trees had grown and died, creeks had changed course, and buildings had been constructed and demolished. Even if she could identify the correct locations, excavation would require equipment, expertise, and discretion that would be difficult to arrange without attracting unwanted attention. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of her situation was the growing realization that her decision about the treasure would define not only her own character, but also the kind of example she wanted to set for Marcus. Her son was at a crucial stage in his development, forming the values and attitudes that would guide his adult life. How she handled this moral dilemma would teach him lessons about integrity, justice, and responsibility that would influence his relationships with others for decades to come. The summer heat continued to build as July progressed, creating an atmosphere of languid tension that seemed to mirror Rebecca's internal struggles. The plantation grounds baked under relentless sunshine, and the old house creaked and settled as its aged timbers expanded and contracted with the temperature changes. The physical environment seemed to be pressing her toward a decision with the same inexorable force that had once driven cotton growth and harvest cycles. Local news reports about racial tensions in other parts of Mississippi reminded Rebecca that the issues she was grappling with were not merely historical curiosities, but contemporary realities that continued to shape people's lives. Church burnings, cross burnings, and economic boycotts were still occurring throughout the state, evidence that the wounds of slavery and segregation had never fully healed, despite legal changes and official proclamations about racial progress. The presence of Morrison's treasure map had transformed what Rebecca had expected to be a straightforward property inheritance into a moral test that would reveal her deepest values and priorities. She was being forced to choose between financial security for her family and acknowledgement of historical injustices that continued to affect her community. The decision she made would determine not only her family's future, but also her ability to live with herself and the example she would set for her son about how to respond when personal interests conflict with moral obligations. As she sat on the plantation's front porch in the evening, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance, among the ancient live oak trees, Rebecca understood that she was facing the most important decision of her life. The map, hidden in Morrison's desk drawer, represented more than buried treasure. It was a challenge to her character that would determine whether she could find a way to honor both her family's needs and the demands of justice in a situation where conventional solutions seemed impossible. The decision came to Rebecca on a sweltering Thursday morning in late July as she stood in the overgrown remnants of what had once been Willowbrook's slave quarters. The crumbling brick foundations and scattered chimney stones marked where dozens of families had lived in forced bondage, their lives constrained by the very man whose treasure map now lay folded in her back pocket. The contrast between the wealth Morrison had accumulated and hidden, and the poverty his workforce had endured to create that wealth, crystallized into a moment of moral clarity that cut through all her weeks of agonized deliberation. She had spent the previous night reading more of Morrison's journal, discovering entries that detailed his plans for post-war resistance and his conviction that the wealth he was hiding would eventually fund the restoration of what he called proper social order. His words revealed a man who viewed slavery not as a moral evil, but as a natural institution that he believed would eventually be restored once Northern occupation ended and federal intervention ceased. The treasure represented not just personal wealth, but a war chest intended to perpetuate the very system of racial oppression that had created it. The journal entries from April 1865 were particularly disturbing, describing Morrison's final preparations as Confederate defeat became inevitable. He had written about selecting the most trustworthy enslaved people to assist with burial operations, then ensuring their silence through methods he described only obliquely, but which clearly involved violence or threats of violence. The clinical way he discussed eliminating witnesses to his treasure-hiding operations revealed a callousness that made Rebecca's stomach turn with revulsion. But it was a specific entry dated April 12, 1865, that finally pushed Rebecca beyond the point of moral paralysis into decisive action. Morrison had written about a young enslaved woman named Sarah who had discovered one of his burial sites and had attempted to claim a portion of the gold for herself. His response had been swift and brutal. Sarah had been sold to a slave trader headed for the Deep South cotton fields, separated forever from her children and husband as punishment for what Morrison characterized as theft of his righteous property. The cruelty of separating a mother from her children for the crime of trying to claim a share of wealth that her own unpaid labor had created struck Rebecca as the ultimate symbol of slavery's moral horror. Sarah's story personalized the abstract injustices that Rebecca had been studying, transforming historical statistics about family separation into a specific narrative of individual suffering that demanded response rather than mere academic understanding. Standing among the ruins where Sarah and hundreds of others had lived in bondage, Rebecca made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not simply claim Morrison's treasure for her own family's benefit, nor would she ignore its existence and allow it to remain buried forever. Instead, she would recover the treasure and use it to address the very injustices that its accumulation had created, returning the wealth to the community whose ancestors had been forced to create it through their unpaid labor. The decision carried enormous risks that Rebecca understood clearly. Legal challenges could arise from multiple directions, including claims by other Morrison descendants, federal investigations into tax implications, and potential criminal charges. If authorities determined that the treasure recovery violated archaeological or historical preservation laws, local white families who had romanticized plantation history might view her actions as betrayal of Southern heritage, while African American community members might question her motives or doubt her commitment to genuine justice rather than mere publicity seeking. Most significantly, her decision meant abandoning the financial security that the treasure could have provided for Marcus's education and her own retirement. The money that could have paid for college tuition, graduate school, and a comfortable middle-class lifestyle would instead be donated to address community needs that might never directly benefit her own family. She was choosing moral principle over material advantage in a way that would have permanent consequences for both her and Marcus's future opportunities. But Rebecca had learned through her years of social work that some decisions transcend personal cost-benefit calculations and demand responses based on fundamental values rather than practical considerations. Her work with troubled families had taught her that children who grow up witnessing moral courage, even when it involves sacrifice, develop stronger character than those who learn that financial advantage justifies compromising ethical principles. The example she set for Marcus in handling this situation would influence his development more profoundly than any college fund or inheritance could. The practical challenges of implementing her decision were immediately apparent. She would need to locate and recover the treasure without attracting attention from law enforcement, treasure hunters, or local residents who might have their own ideas about how such wealth should be distributed. The recovery process would require equipment, expertise, and assistance from people she could trust to maintain discretion while sharing her commitment to using the wealth responsibly. More complex would be determining how to distribute recovered treasure in ways that genuinely addressed historical injustices rather than simply creating new problems or conflicts. Direct cash payments to individuals could trigger tax liabilities, legal disputes over eligibility, and community tensions over distribution methods. Institutional approaches through churches, schools, or community organizations might be more sustainable, but would require careful planning to ensure that funds reached intended beneficiaries rather than disappearing into administrative overhead or corruption. Rebecca's first step was to approach Reverend Washington at Mount Olive Baptist Church, the community leader who seemed most likely to understand both the historical significance of her discovery and the moral complexities involved in addressing its implications. She had been impressed by his Sunday sermon about forgiveness and reconciliation, but more importantly, she had observed his practical leadership in organizing community programs that provided concrete assistance to families struggling with poverty and discrimination. Her conversation with Reverend Washington took place on a humid evening in his church office, a small room lined with theological books, community service awards, and photographs documenting decades of civil rights activism. The Reverend listened carefully as Rebecca explained her discovery and her intentions, his expression shifting from surprise to skepticism to cautious hope as he began to understand the unprecedented nature of what she was proposing. "Mrs. Morrison," he said finally, using the formal address that reflected both respect and emotional distance, "I've heard stories about buried treasure all my life. My grandmother used to tell tales about gold hidden on the old plantations. But most folks assumed they were just wishful thinking or folklore passed down to help people cope with poverty. If what you're saying is true, and if you're genuinely committed to using such wealth to benefit our community, then you're talking about something that could change a lot of lives." But Reverend Washington also expressed concerns that reflected his experience with well-meaning white people whose good intentions had not always translated into effective or respectful assistance. "I need to ask you directly, Mrs. Morrison, what assurance do we have that this isn't just another case of white guilt that will disappear when things get complicated or expensive? We've seen plenty of people who wanted to help until they realized how much genuine change would cost them personally. Rebecca appreciated his directness and recognized the validity of his skepticism. Her social work experience had taught her that trust between communities with histories of conflict required demonstration rather than mere declaration, and that good intentions without sustained commitment often created more harm than benefit. She would need to prove her sincerity through actions rather than words, and she would need to accept community leadership in determining how recovered wealth could most effectively address local needs. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, ranging from practical questions about recovery methods to philosophical discussions about justice, reparations, and community healing. Reverend Washington's insights helped Rebecca understand that her treasure discovery had the potential to become either a powerful tool for addressing historical injustices or another source of community division and disappointment, depending entirely on how the recovery and distribution process was managed. By the end of their meeting, they had agreed on a preliminary approach that would involve careful community consultation before any recovery attempts began. Reverend Washington would discuss the situation with other church leaders and longtime community members, gathering input about whether Rebecca's proposal seemed genuine and whether community participation in such an effort would be advisable. Rebecca would meanwhile conduct additional research to verify the treasure's existence and develop more detailed plans for recovery operations. The agreement represented a fundamental shift in Rebecca's relationship with Magnolia County's African-American community. She was no longer simply a white woman who had inherited plantation property, but someone who was actively seeking to address the historical injustices that her inheritance represented. The change in status brought both opportunities and responsibilities that would require her to navigate complex racial dynamics with sensitivity and humility. Her decision also meant confronting the reactions of local white residents who might view her actions as betrayal of family heritage or Southern tradition. Mrs. Hendricks at the library had already made several comments about the importance of preserving plantation history and honoring the memory of Confederate veterans, attitudes that suggested significant resistance to any efforts that challenged romanticized narratives about the antebellum period. More immediately challenging was explaining her decision to Marcus, whose initial enthusiasm about their Mississippi inheritance had been based partly on excitement about the adventure and independence that plantation life offered. He had been looking forward to starting his junior year at the local high school, where he had already made friends and begun to feel more settled than he had since his father's departure. Rebecca's decision to use the treasure for community benefit rather than family advancement would require him to understand moral complexities that many adults struggled to grasp. The conversation with Marcus took place on the front porch of Willowbrook, as they watched the sun set over cotton fields that had once been worked by enslaved people whose descendants still lived in the area. Rebecca explained her discovery and her decision with the same honesty and directness that had characterized their discussions about his father's abandonment, treating him as someone capable of understanding difficult truths rather than protecting him from moral complexity. Marcus's initial reaction was predictable disappointment mixed with confusion about why his mother would choose to give away wealth that could solve their family's financial problems. "Mom, I don't understand why we have to be responsible for things that happened before we were even born. Can't we just use some of the money for college and give the rest away? Why does it have to be all or nothing? Rebecca recognized the reasonableness of his questions and the difficulty of explaining why moral decisions sometimes require responses that seem disproportionate to personal responsibility. Her answer drew on lessons from her social work experience about how historical injustices create contemporary inequalities that persist until they are actively addressed, rather than simply ignored or minimized. Marcus, the money that's buried on this property wasn't earned through honest work. It was stolen from people who were forced to work without pay, then hidden by the same person who profited from their suffering, using that money for our own benefit. Even if we give some of it away, would make us part of the same system that created the injustice in the first place. Sometimes doing the right thing means giving up advantages that we could claim legally, but not morally. The discussion continued throughout the evening, with Marcus gradually beginning to understand the historical context and moral implications of their situation. His questions helped Rebecca refine her own thinking about how to explain her decision to others who might be equally confused about why she was choosing principle over profit in a situation where most people would prioritize their family's financial security. As the night deepened and insects began their chorus among the ancient live oak trees, Rebecca felt the weight of her decision settling into permanent resolution. She had chosen a path that would require sustained commitment, community cooperation, and personal sacrifice, but which offered the possibility of transforming a symbol of historical injustice into a tool for contemporary healing. The treasure map that had initially seemed like a solution to her family's financial problems had become instead an opportunity to demonstrate that moral courage could still prevail over material self-interest in a world that often seemed to reward cynicism over principle. The woman who had come to Mississippi with the simple intention of settling an inheritance had committed herself to undertaking one of the most significant acts of historical reparations in American history, using buried Confederate treasure to benefit the descendants of enslaved people whose unpaid labor had created that wealth over a century earlier. The process of building trust with Magnolia County's African-American community proved far more complex than Rebecca had anticipated. Word of her proposal spread quickly through networks centered around Mount Olive Baptist Church, generating reactions that ranged from cautious optimism to outright suspicion. Many community members had experienced decades of disappointment with white people who made grand promises about racial reconciliation but disappeared when sustained effort was required, leaving behind broken commitments and deeper cynicism about the possibility of genuine change. Mrs. Josephine Turner, the elderly church member whose great-grandmother had been enslaved at Willowbrook, became Rebecca's most important ally in navigating these delicate relationship dynamics. At 83, Mrs. Turner possessed both the moral authority that came from surviving decades of Jim Crow segregation and the practical wisdom needed to distinguish between authentic commitment and mere performance of good intentions. Her initial skepticism had gradually evolved into guarded support as she observed Rebecca's willingness to listen rather than assume she understood the community's needs and priorities. During one of their regular conversations on Mrs. Turner's front porch, the elderly woman shared family stories that helped Rebecca understand how deeply the trauma of slavery had affected subsequent generations. Her great-grandmother, Sarah Washington, had been the same woman whose story Rebecca had discovered in Morrison's journal, the enslaved mother who had been sold away from her children for attempting to claim a portion of the gold she had been forced to help bury. My great-grandmother never saw her children again after Master Morrison sold her down to Alabama, Mrs. Turner explained, her voice carrying the weight of inherited grief. But she kept hoping until the day she died that somehow she'd find her way back to them. The family stories say she used to dream about that gold she'd seen him bury, thinking maybe if she could get some of it, she could buy her way back to Mississippi and find her babies. The personal connection between Mrs. Turner's family and Morrison's treasure gave Rebecca's proposal a specificity and emotional resonance that abstract discussions of historical reparations could never achieve. This was not merely about addressing general injustices from the distant past, but about returning wealth to the direct descendants of people who had been brutalized in its accumulation and concealment. But Mrs. Turner also warned Rebecca about the potential complications that such a discovery could create within the African American community itself. "Honey, you need to understand that finding that gold is going to bring out both the best and worst in folks. Some people are going to see it as a blessing that could help the whole community, but others are going to think about what they could do with that money for their own families. Money changes people, even good people, and you better be prepared for jealousy and fighting that you never expected." The community meetings that Reverend Washington organized to discuss Rebecca's proposal revealed the full complexity of reactions within Magnolia County's African American leadership. The gatherings took place in the church basement, where folding chairs arranged in concentric circles created an atmosphere of democratic discussion that encouraged participation from people who might have remained silent in more formal settings. Dr. Marcus Williams, a retired educator who had spent 40 years teaching in segregated and later integrated schools, expressed both appreciation for Rebecca's intentions and concern about the precedent her actions might establish. "I'm grateful that Mrs. Morrison recognizes the moral problems with her inheritance," he said during one evening session. "But I worry about what happens when other white families decide they can buy forgiveness for historical sins with one-time payments while continuing to benefit from ongoing systems of inequality." His concerns reflected broader debates within African American intellectual and political circles about whether reparations should focus on individual payments, institutional reforms, or systemic changes to economic and political structures that perpetuated racial disparities. The treasure discovery had the potential to contribute to these discussions, but it also risked becoming a distraction from larger policy changes that might have more lasting impact on racial justice. Other community members raised practical questions about how the treasure recovery process would work and what safeguards would prevent the project from becoming another example of white people controlling resources that were intended to benefit African American families. Deacon James Patterson, a retired factory worker whose grandfather had sharecropped land near Willowbrook, insisted that community members must be involved in every aspect of the recovery and distribution process, rather than simply serving as passive beneficiaries of Rebecca's charity. "We've seen too many programs where white folks decided what was best for us without asking what we actually needed," Deacon Patterson observed. "If this treasure really belongs to our community because our ancestors' blood and sweat created Then we need to be partners in deciding what happens with it, not just grateful recipients of whatever Mrs. Morrison thinks we deserve. His point resonated with other participants who emphasized the importance of community self-determination in any reparations process. They wanted assurance that recovered wealth would be used to strengthen African American institutions and leadership, rather than creating new forms of dependency on white benevolence, however well-intentioned such benevolence might be. The discussions also revealed generational differences in how community members viewed Rebecca's proposal. Older residents who had lived through the civil rights movement tended to be more cautious about trusting white allies, having experienced repeated disappointments with people who withdrew their support when racial justice work became costly or controversial. Younger participants were more willing to accept Rebecca's stated intentions at face value, but they also expressed impatience with gradual approaches to addressing racial inequalities. Anthony Washington, Reverend Washington's 28-year-old son who had recently returned from law school, articulated concerns that reflected contemporary debates about racial justice and economic inequality. "I appreciate Mrs. Morrison's recognition that this wealth was stolen from our ancestors," he said, "but individual acts of conscience can't substitute for systematic changes in how this country deals with the legacy of slavery. We need policies that address educational funding, criminal justice reform, and economic development, not just symbolic gestures that make white people feel better about history." His comments sparked extended discussion about the relationship between individual moral actions and broader social change, with some participants arguing that Rebecca's treasure discovery could serve as a catalyst for larger conversations about reparations and racial justice. Others worried that focusing on buried Confederate gold would distract attention from contemporary issues like voter suppression, employment discrimination, and inadequate public services that required political rather than charitable solutions. The complexity of these discussions forced Rebecca to confront the limitations of her initial assumptions about how to address the moral implications of her inheritance. She had expected that her willingness to give up personal financial advantage would be sufficient to demonstrate her commitment to racial justice, but community feedback made clear that genuine partnership would require much deeper engagement. With questions of power, control, and long-term institutional change, her education in these dynamics continued through individual conversations with community members who were willing to share their perspectives on how historical injustices continued to shape contemporary life in Magnolia County. These discussions took place in various settings: front porches, beauty salons, auto repair shops, and church kitchens, where people felt comfortable speaking frankly about their experiences and concerns. Ruby Johnson, a middle-aged nurse who worked at the county hospital, explained how the economic legacy of slavery persisted in contemporary employment patterns that limited African American advancement opportunities. "My grandmother cleaned houses for white families her whole life, because that was the only work available to black women back then," she told Rebecca during a conversation at the hospital cafeteria. "I was able to become a nurse, which was progress, but I'm still one of only 3 black nurses in this whole hospital, and none of us have been promoted to supervisory positions, despite having more experience than some of the white nurses who got those jobs." Her observations helped Rebecca understand that the treasure discovery occurred within a context of ongoing racial inequalities that required sustained attention rather than one-time solutions. The gold buried by Morrison represented historical injustices, But those injustices had created contemporary problems that demanded comprehensive approaches involving education, employment, healthcare, and political representation. Meanwhile, Rebecca's research into the practical aspects of treasure recovery revealed additional complications that would need to be addressed before any excavation could begin. She had consulted with archaeologists at the University of Mississippi, who explained that any recovery operation involving Civil War-era artifacts would require permits from state historical preservation authorities and potentially federal agencies. If the site qualified for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places, the permitting process would inevitably attract public attention that could compromise the community-based approach that Rebecca and Reverend Washington had envisioned. Media coverage of a treasure discovery would likely bring unwanted scrutiny from treasure hunters, legal challenges from other potential claimants, and political controversy that could overshadow the moral and historical issues that Rebecca wanted. To highlight, Dr. Sarah Chen, the archaeologist who served as Rebecca's primary consultant on these matters, recommended an approach that would satisfy legal requirements while minimizing unwanted attention. You'll need to frame this as a historical research project rather than a treasure hunt, she advised. Emphasize the educational and cultural heritage aspects of what you're doing and make sure you have community support documented before you apply for any permits. The legal complexities were equally challenging. Rebecca had consulted with attorneys who specialized in property law, historical preservation, and civil rights issues, discovering that her situation touched on multiple areas of law that rarely intersected in practice. The treasure's legal status was unclear under Mississippi law, which had provisions for both found property and historical artifacts that might apply depending on how the recovery was conducted and documented. More concerning were potential federal tax implications that could affect both Rebecca and any community members who received portions of recovered wealth. The Internal Revenue Service had specific regulations governing found treasure that required its full market value to be reported as income in the year of discovery, creating tax liabilities that could exceed the financial capacity of working class families to pay. Attorney Michelle Rodriguez, who specialized in civil rights law, helped Rebecca understand that the tax implications could be addressed through careful structuring of any distribution process. If the wealth goes directly to community organizations rather than individuals, you can avoid most of the personal tax problems, she explained. But you'll need to make sure those organizations have proper non-profit status and that the funds are used for purposes that qualify for tax-exempt treatment. The legal consultations reinforced Rebecca's understanding that good intentions were insufficient to ensure positive outcomes from her treasure discovery. Every aspect of the recovery and distribution process would need to be carefully planned and professionally managed to avoid creating new problems while addressing historical injustices. As summer progressed toward fall, Rebecca found herself spending increasing amounts of time in community meetings, legal consultations, and research activities that were transforming her understanding of both her family's history and her own responsibilities as someone who had inherited the benefits of historical injustices. The woman who had come to Mississippi, expecting to quickly settle an estate and return to Chicago, was becoming deeply embedded in local relationships and obligations that would require years rather than months to fulfill properly. Marcus observed, These changes in his mother were the mixture of pride and concern, recognizing that her commitment to using the treasure for community benefit was consistent with the values she had taught him, but also understanding that their family's future was becoming increasingly uncertain as she devoted more time and resources to addressing historical wrongs rather than securing their personal financial stability. The transformation in Rebecca's daily life was profound and irreversible. She was no longer simply managing an inherited property, but had become a focal point for community discussions about racial justice, historical memory, and the possibility of healing divisions that had persisted for over a century. The first serious opposition to Rebecca's treasure project emerged from an unexpected source: her own extended family. Word of her intentions had somehow reached other Morrison descendants scattered across the South, and by early September she was receiving phone calls, letters, and even unannounced visits from relatives she had never met who claimed legal rights to any treasure recovered from Willowbrook Plantation. The most persistent challenger was her second cousin, Bradley Morrison Whitfield, a real estate developer from Atlanta who arrived at Willowbrook on a humid Tuesday morning driving a black Mercedes and wearing an expensive suit that seemed designed to intimidate rather than impress. Bradley represented everything Rebecca had come to dislike about inherited privilege. He spoke casually about family heritage and Southern honor, while demonstrating no understanding of the moral complexities involved in profiting from wealth accumulated through slave labor. "Rebecca, I understand you've gotten some liberal ideas about giving away family assets to make yourself feel better about history," Bradley said as they sat in Willowbrook's formal parlor, his tone combining condescension with barely concealed anger. "But you need to understand that this property and anything on it belongs to the entire Morrison family, not just you. If there's treasure buried here, it's rightfully ours, and I won't stand by while you hand it over to people who have no legal claim to it." Bradley's presence at Willowbrook represented more than just family greed. It embodied the broader white Southern resistance to acknowledging slavery's ongoing legacy that Rebecca had been encountering throughout her time in Mississippi. His casual dismissal of African-American historical claims and his assumption that legal ownership trumped moral obligations revealed the same mindset that had allowed slavery to persist for generations, despite its obvious contradictions with American ideals of freedom and equality. The legal threat that Bradley represented was serious and immediate. As a direct Morrison descendant, he could potentially file court challenges that would freeze any treasure recovery efforts while ownership questions were litigated. More troubling, his real estate development background meant he had both the financial resources and legal expertise to pursue such challenges aggressively, potentially tying up the project for years while community interest and momentum dissipated. But Bradley's arrival also galvanized support for Rebecca's project among people who might otherwise have remained neutral. His obvious contempt for local African-American residents and his aggressive attempts to assert control over the treasure recovery process demonstrated exactly the kind of attitude that Rebecca's community-based approach was designed to challenge and overcome. Reverend Washington's reaction to Bradley's interference was swift and decisive. "Mrs. Morrison, this situation shows exactly why our community has learned to be suspicious of white people who promise to do right by us," he told Rebecca during an emergency meeting at the church. "We've seen too many cases where good intentions disappeared as soon as money or family pressure got involved. The question now is whether you're going to stand by your commitments or let your cousin intimidate you into abandoning everything we've been working toward. The test of Rebecca's resolve came during a heated confrontation at Willowbrook, when Bradley returned with his own attorney and a court order demanding access to examine the property and any historical documents related to potential treasure. The legal papers were technically valid, but represented an attempt to use judicial authority to override the community consultation process that Rebecca had established as the foundation of her approach. Rebecca's response to this challenge defined her transformation from reluctant inheritor to committed activist. Rather than allowing Bradley's legal maneuvering to derail her community-based approach, she used his interference as an opportunity to demonstrate her unwavering commitment to the principles she had established. Standing on Willowbrook's front porch with Bradley, his attorney, community leaders, and local media representatives present, she made a public statement that left no doubt about her priorities. This treasure was created through the unpaid labor of enslaved people, and it will be returned to their descendants regardless of what legal challenges my family members might pursue, she declared, her voice carrying a strength and conviction that surprised even herself. If Bradley Whitfield wants to fight me in court, he's welcome to try, but he'll be arguing that Morrison family legal rights matter more than moral obligations to the people our ancestor brutalized. I don't think that's a position any decent person would want to defend publicly. The confrontation attracted media attention that Rebecca had hoped to avoid, but which ultimately served her purposes by exposing the moral dimensions of treasure ownership questions that might otherwise have been treated as purely legal or financial matters. Local newspapers, television stations, and eventually national media outlets picked up the story of a white woman fighting her own family to return Confederate treasure to descendants of enslaved people, creating pressure on Bradley and other potential challengers to justify their claims in moral as well as legal terms. The media coverage also revealed the broader political implications of Rebecca's project within the context of ongoing national debates about reparations, Confederate monuments, and historical memory. Conservative commentators criticized her actions as politically correct grandstanding that ignored property rights and legal precedent, while progressive voices praised her moral courage and called for similar acknowledgments of historical injustices throughout the South. But the most significant impact of the publicity was its effect on Magnolia County's white community, where reactions ranged from quiet support to open hostility. Some white residents appreciated Rebecca's efforts to address historical injustices and recognized that her approach could help heal racial divisions that had persisted for generations. Others viewed her actions as betrayal of Southern heritage and an implicit criticism of their own family's historical roles in maintaining systems of racial oppression. The division within the white community became apparent during a tense town hall meeting organized by the county commission to discuss the implications of the treasure discovery for local economic development and tourism promotion. The meeting, held in the high school gymnasium, drew an overflow crowd that reflected the deep community interest in issues that went far beyond simple questions about buried gold. County Commissioner Robert Patterson, whose family had lived in the area for 4 generations, attempted to present a moderate position that acknowledged both the historical significance of Rebecca's discovery and the potential economic benefits that responsible treasure recovery could bring to the entire community. We need to find ways to honor our history, all of our history, while also working together to build a better future for everyone who lives here, he said, trying to bridge divisions that seemed to be widening rather than narrowing as the project gained attention. But his attempted compromise satisfied neither side of the emerging controversy. White residents who opposed Rebecca's reparations approach accused him of capitulating to political correctness and abandoning principles of property rights and individual liberty that they considered fundamental to American values. African American community members questioned whether his talk of working together was genuine commitment to racial justice or merely another attempt to control and limit their participation in decisions about resources that rightfully belonged to their community. The town hall meeting's most dramatic moment came when Rebecca was confronted by Martha Henley, an elderly white woman whose great-grandfather had served under General Morrison in the Confederate Army. Mrs. Henley's emotional speech reflected the depth of white Southern attachment to romanticized narratives about the Civil War era that portrayed Confederate leaders as honorable defenders of states' rights, rather than participants in a system designed to perpetuate human bondage. My great-grandfather fought alongside General Morrison to defend our homeland from Northern invasion, Mrs. Henley declared, her voice shaking with emotion. These men were heroes who sacrificed everything for principles they believed in, and now you want to desecrate their memory by turning their legacy over to people who weren't even alive when these events happened. This is about destroying Southern heritage and making white people feel guilty for things we had nothing to do with. Rebecca's response to Mrs. Henley's challenge required all the diplomatic skills she had developed through years of social work with hostile clients and resistant family systems. She recognized that Mrs. Henley's emotional attachment to Confederate memory was genuine, even though it was based on historical narratives that ignored or minimized slavery's central role in causing the Civil War. Any response that simply dismissed those feelings would likely alienate potential allies while strengthening opposition to her project. Mrs. Henley, I understand your desire to honor your great-grandfather's memory, and I'm not asking you to feel guilty about things you didn't do, Rebecca replied carefully. But I am asking all of us to acknowledge that the wealth General Morrison buried was created by people who were forced to work without pay and who were threatened with violence if they tried to claim any portion of what their labor had produced. Honoring your ancestors' courage doesn't require ignoring the suffering that slavery caused, and returning stolen wealth to its rightful owners doesn't dishonor anyone's military service. The exchange crystallized the fundamental disagreement about historical memory and moral responsibility that would continue to complicate Rebecca's project throughout its implementation. For people like Mrs. Henley, the treasure represented legitimate family inheritance that should be preserved as a symbol of Confederate heritage and Southern identity. For Rebecca and her African-American community partners, the same treasure represented stolen wealth that needed to be returned to address ongoing injustices created by slavery's legacy. The political pressure intensified when state legislators began taking positions on the treasure controversy. with some calling for legal protection of Confederate heritage sites and others supporting Rebecca's reparations approach as a model for addressing historical injustices throughout the South. The involvement of elected officials transformed what had begun as a local community project into a symbolic battleground for larger national debates about race, history, and justice. Governor Ronnie Musgrove found himself caught between competing pressures from constituents who viewed the treasure controversy as either an opportunity for racial healing or an attack on Southern culture. His carefully worded public statements attempted to support both historical preservation and community reconciliation without taking clear positions that might alienate voters on either side of the controversy. The escalating political attention created new challenges for Rebecca's community-based approach, as media coverage and legislative debates threatened to overshadow the careful relationship-building work that she and Reverend Washington had identified as essential for genuine success. The treasure recovery was becoming a public spectacle rather than a private act of moral conscience, with implications that extended far beyond Magnolia County's boundaries. At the same time, the opposition from Bradley and other Morrison descendants was creating practical obstacles that required immediate attention. Legal challenges were consuming time and resources that Rebecca had hoped to devote to community consultation and treasure recovery planning. More significantly, the family conflict was generating negative publicity that portrayed her project as motivated by personal animosity rather than genuine commitment to racial justice. The stress of managing these multiple pressures was taking a toll on Rebecca's health and her relationship with Marcus, who found himself caught between pride in his mother's moral courage and frustration with the chaos that her decisions were creating in their lives. The quiet summer of property assessment that they had originally planned had become a highly publicized controversy that affected every aspect of their daily existence. As September ended, and the first hints of fall weather began to moderate Mississippi's oppressive humidity, Rebecca realized that her treasure project had evolved far beyond her original conception into something that would require sustained commitment and community support to succeed. The opposition she was facing from her own family and segments of the white community was fierce and well organized, but it was also generating support from people who recognized the historical significance of what she was attempting to accomplish. The battle for Morrison's treasure had become a test of whether moral courage could prevail over entrenched interests and inherited privilege in a situation where the stakes involved not just money, but fundamental questions about justice, memory, and the possibility of healing America's deepest historical wounds. The crisis that would test everything Rebecca had built came on a cold October morning when she arrived at Willowbrook to find the property surrounded by protesters, media vehicles, and law enforcement officers. Overnight, someone had leaked the specific locations marked on Morrison's treasure map to a white supremacist group called the Sons of Confederate Honor, who claimed they were protecting Southern heritage from what they characterized as a politically motivated assault on white history and culture. The scene that greeted Rebecca was unlike anything she had experienced in her years of social work with troubled families or community crisis intervention. Nearly 50 protesters carrying Confederate flags and signs reading "Protect Our Heritage" and "Stop Anti-White Racism" had established a camp along the road leading to Willowbrook's main entrance. Their presence had attracted counter-protesters from civil rights organizations, creating a volatile confrontation that required constant police supervision to prevent violence. Television news trucks from Jackson, Memphis, and Atlanta lined the narrow country road, their satellite dishes and camera crews transforming the quiet plantation into a media circus that bore no resemblance to the community-based reconciliation project that Rebecca had envisioned. The treasure hunt that was supposed to address historical injustices had become a contemporary battleground where opposing sides fought over symbols and narratives rather than engaging with the complex moral questions that had motivated Rebecca's original decision. Sheriff James Mitchell, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who had been hoping to avoid involvement in what he considered a private family matter, found himself managing a security situation that threatened to spiral out of control. The sheriff's department lacked the resources and training needed to handle large-scale protests, especially ones involving racial tensions that could easily trigger violence if not managed carefully. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to understand that I can't guarantee anyone's safety if this situation continues to escalate, Sheriff Mitchell told Rebecca as they stood on Willowbrook's front porch, watching protesters on both sides test the boundaries of their designated areas. We've already had 2 arrests for disorderly conduct, and I've got reports that more groups are planning to arrive over the weekend. This has gotten way beyond anything we can handle with local resources. The sheriff's warning crystallized Rebecca's growing realization that her treasure project had unleashed forces far more dangerous and destructive than she had anticipated. The careful community consultation process that she had established with Reverend Washington and other African American leaders was being overwhelmed by outside agitators who had their own agendas for exploiting racial tensions and historical grievances. Most disturbing was the discovery that the Sons of Confederate Honor had obtained detailed copies of Morrison's map and journal entries, information that could only have come from someone with access to Rebecca's private research materials. The security breach suggested that her project had been infiltrated by people who were actively working to sabotage her community-based approach in favor of approaches that would either claim the treasure for white supremacist causes or prevent its recovery entirely. Bradley Morrison Whitfield's role in the security breach became apparent when he arrived at the protest site with lawyers and representatives from a Confederate Heritage Foundation that promised to fund legal challenges to any treasure recovery efforts that did not respect what they called legitimate family inheritance rights. His willingness to collaborate with white supremacist groups revealed the depths of his opposition to Rebecca's reparations project and his commitment to preventing African American community involvement in decisions about Morrison family assets. Rebecca, you've brought this chaos on yourself and this entire community, Bradley declared during a confrontation that was captured by multiple television cameras. If you had simply handled this matter through proper legal channels instead of trying to score political points with your guilt-ridden liberal agenda, none of this would be happening. The blood of anyone who gets hurt here is on your hands. His attempt to blame Rebecca for violence threatened by white supremacist groups reflected the same kind of moral inversion that had allowed slavery to persist for generations despite its obvious contradictions with Christian and democratic values. Bradley was holding Rebecca responsible for confrontation caused by people who opposed her efforts to address historical injustices, creating a narrative where victims of oppression became responsible for violence committed by their oppressors. The most immediate threat came from reports that armed militia groups from neighboring states were planning to converge on Magnolia County to protect Confederate heritage sites from what they characterized as anti-white terrorism. These groups had histories of violence and intimidation that could transform the current tense but peaceful protest into a deadly confrontation that would overshadow any positive outcomes from the treasure recovery project. Federal authorities became involved when the FBI's domestic terrorism unit identified several known extremists among the Confederate heritage protesters and discovered social media communications discussing plans for armed resistance to any treasure recovery efforts. The federal investigation transformed Rebecca's local community project into a national security matter that would require coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and potentially military intervention if violence erupted. At the same time, the crisis was creating divisions within Magnolia County's African American community that threatened to undermine the unity that had been essential for the project's community-based approach. Some church members argued that the treasure recovery should be abandoned rather than risk violence that could harm innocent people, while others insisted that backing down in the face of white supremacist threats would validate the same kind of intimidation that had been used to suppress African American rights for generations. The generational divide that had been present from the beginning of community discussions became more pronounced as older residents who had lived through the civil rights movement expressed caution about confronting organized white supremacist groups, while younger activists argued that retreat would send a message that racial justice could be prevented through threats and intimidation. Anthony Washington, Reverend Washington's son, emerged as a spokesperson for younger community members who wanted to proceed with treasure recovery despite the risks involved. Our ancestors faced lynching, bombings, and murder for trying to claim basic civil rights, he argued during a heated church meeting. Are we going to let the fear of white violence stop us from reclaiming wealth that was stolen from our families? If we back down now, we're telling every racist group in the country that they can stop progress by showing up with guns and flags. But Mrs. Josephine Turner, whose family stories had provided crucial support for Rebecca's project, expressed the concerns of older residents who had seen too many promising civil rights initiatives destroyed by violence that accomplished nothing, except creating martyrs and deeper divisions. Child, I've seen what happens when good people get caught up in confrontations with hateful folks who have nothing to lose, she told Anthony during one particularly tense discussion. Sometimes wisdom means knowing when to step back and find another way to achieve your goals. The debate within the African American community reflected broader questions about tactics and strategy that had characterized civil rights movements throughout American history. The treasure discovery had created an opportunity to address historical injustices, but it had also attracted opposition that could destroy not only the specific project, but also the broader relationships and trust that had been built between community members during months of careful consultation and planning. Rebecca found herself caught between these competing perspectives, while also managing the practical challenges of protecting her family's safety and maintaining her legal position against challenges from Bradley and other relatives. The simple moral clarity that had guided her initial decision to use the treasure for community benefit was being complicated by tactical questions about how to respond to threats and intimidation without abandoning principles or endangering innocent people. The situation reached a breaking point when Marcus was confronted by white students at his high school who accused his mother of being a race traitor and threatened him with violence if the treasure recovery project continued. The incident occurred in the school cafeteria, where Marcus was eating lunch with friends when a group of older students surrounded his table and began making racist comments about his family's collaboration with African-American community members. Your mama thinks she can give away white people's money to a bunch of ungrateful N-words who ought to be thankful for everything white folks have already done for them, said Tommy Patterson, the 17-year-old son of a local farmer whose family had opposed school integration in the 1960s. Maybe somebody needs to teach both of you what happens to race traitors who forget which side they're supposed to be on. The confrontation escalated when Marcus refused to back down from his support for his mother's project, leading to a physical altercation that resulted in both boys being suspended from school and Marcus receiving death threats that were serious enough to require police investigation. The incident made clear that the treasure controversy was affecting not just Rebecca and her adult community partners, but also their children who were being forced to choose sides in conflicts they had not created. The threats against Marcus forced Rebecca to confront the possibility that her moral courage was putting her son at risk in ways that might not be justified by the potential benefits of the treasure recovery project. Her years of social work had taught her that protecting children's safety and well-being must take precedence over adult political and moral commitments, even when those commitments addressed legitimate injustices. The crisis deepened when someone fired gunshots at Willowbrook's windows during the night, shattering glass in the library where Rebecca had discovered Morrison's map and journal. The attack occurred while Rebecca and Marcus were staying at a hotel in Jackson for their own safety, but it demonstrated that opponents of the treasure project were willing to use violence to prevent its implementation. Sheriff Mitchell's investigation of the shooting revealed evidence that the attack had been carefully planned by people with detailed knowledge of the plantation's layout and the location of the treasure discovery. The incident was not random vandalism, but targeted intimidation designed to force Rebecca to abandon her project and leave Mississippi entirely. The gunshots marked a point of no return in the escalating conflict over Morrison's treasure. What had begun as a personal moral decision about how to address historical injustices had become a violent confrontation that threatened to destroy not only Rebecca's project, but also the broader relationships and trust that connected different communities in Magnolia County. Federal marshals were assigned to provide security for Rebecca and Marcus, while FBI investigators worked to identify and prosecute those responsible for the shooting and the ongoing threats. The federal protection represented acknowledgement that the treasure controversy had become a national security matter that required resources beyond local law enforcement capabilities. But it also transformed Rebecca's community-based project into something resembling a military occupation that alienated potential supporters while empowering extremist opponents. As October ended and the first cold weather of autumn settled over Mississippi, Rebecca realized that the next phase of her treasure project would determine not only whether historical injustices could be addressed through individual moral action, but also whether communities could work together to resist the forces of hatred and division that sought to prevent progress toward racial justice and reconciliation. The battle for Morrison's treasure had become a test of American democracy itself. revealing whether moral courage and community cooperation could prevail over organized hatred and inherited privilege in a confrontation that would influence race relations throughout the South for generations to come. The solution came from an unexpected source: Hurricane Isabel, a Category 2 storm that swept across Mississippi in early November, forcing both protesters and counter-protesters to abandon their positions and seek shelter. The hurricane's arrival created a natural pause in the escalating confrontation, while simultaneously creating emergency conditions that required cooperation between community members who had been divided by the treasure controversy. When the storm struck Magnolia County with sustained winds of 90 miles per hour and torrential rains that flooded low-lying areas, the artificial divisions between black and white residents became temporarily irrelevant in the face of shared danger and mutual need for assistance. Emergency shelters were established in schools and churches without regard to racial demographics, and rescue operations required volunteers from all segments of the community working together to help neighbors trapped by flooding or damaged by falling trees. Rebecca found herself coordinating relief efforts from Mount Olive Baptist Church, which had been designated as one of the primary emergency shelters due to its solid construction and central location. The irony of white supremacist protesters and African-American civil rights activists sharing the same shelter space while helping each other cope with storm damage was not lost on anyone present, though the immediate demands of emergency response left little time for reflection on the broader implications. The hurricane's most significant impact on the treasure controversy came when floodwaters from the Swollen Leaf River inundated the area near Willowbrook, where Morrison's map indicated the largest cache of buried wealth. The flooding scoured away decades of accumulated soil and debris, exposing unusual depressions and metallic anomalies that confirmed the accuracy of the Confederate generals' carefully drawn notations. Marcus discovered the exposed treasure site while helping with post-storm cleanup efforts around the plantation. The 17-year-old had been using a metal detector borrowed from the sheriff's department to search for debris that might pose safety hazards when the device began registering strong signals from an area that corresponded exactly to the symbols on Morrison's map. "Mom, you need to come see this," Marcus called excitedly as Rebecca approached carrying a chainsaw to help clear fallen trees from the plantation's access road. "The metal detector is going crazy over here, and I can see what looks like the corner of a metal box sticking up through the mud where the floodwater washed everything away." The discovery of actual treasure transformed the abstract moral and political debates that had characterized the previous months into immediate practical questions about recovery, security, and distribution. The metal container that Marcus had located proved to be the first of several caches that became visible as floodwaters receded, creating an urgent need for professional archaeological recovery before looters or additional weather events could compromise the site. Dr. Sarah Chen, the University of Mississippi archaeologist who had been consulting with Rebecca about proper recovery procedures, arrived within hours of Marcus's discovery, accompanied by graduate students and equipment needed for systematic excavation. The hurricane's aftermath had created ideal conditions for archaeological work, with natural processes having cleared away surface debris while exposing artifacts that might otherwise have required months of careful digging to locate. The first Cache that was properly excavated contained gold coins, jewelry, and silver bullion worth approximately $2 million at current precious metal prices. The items were carefully catalogued and photographed before being secured in bank vaults, while legal and community consultation processes determined their ultimate disposition. But more significant than the monetary value was the discovery of documents wrapped in oiled leather that provided detailed records of how Morrison had acquired and concealed his wealth. The documents revealed that Morrison's treasure represented not just personal assets, but also wealth that had been entrusted to him by other Confederate families who expected him to preserve their resources until political conditions allowed for safe recovery. Some of the gold had been stolen from Union supply trains, while other portions represented the liquidated assets of plantation owners who had converted their wealth to portable form as Confederate defeat became inevitable. Most disturbing were records indicating that Morrison had used enslaved people not only to bury the treasure, but also to eliminate witnesses who might have revealed its locations to federal authorities. The documents contained coded references to permanent solutions for security concerns that strongly suggested the murder of enslaved workers who had participated in burial operations. These revelations added new moral dimensions to the treasure recovery project by confirming that the wealth represented not only stolen labor, but also the proceeds of criminal activities, including robbery and murder. The discovery made clear that returning the treasure to descendant communities was not merely a gesture of historical reconciliation, but a matter of basic justice that addressed specific crimes committed against identifiable victims. The hurricane's aftermath also created opportunities for community healing that had been impossible during the height of the protest confrontations. Shared experiences of storm damage and recovery work had broken down some of the barriers between white and African American residents, while the dramatic treasure discovery had captured public attention in ways that focused on historical facts. Rather than contemporary political controversies, Sheriff Mitchell found himself working closely with Reverend Washington and other African American community leaders to provide security for the excavation sites, while ensuring that recovery operations were conducted transparently and professionally. The cooperation between law enforcement and civil rights leaders represented a significant change from the antagonistic relationship that had characterized their interactions during the protest period. Reverend Washington, I want you to know that I've learned some things about this community's history that I never understood before, Sheriff Mitchell told the pastor during one of their regular coordination meetings. My own great-grandfather fought in the Confederate Army, and I grew up hearing stories about Southern honor and states' rights that never mentioned slavery or what it really meant for people like your ancestors. This treasure discovery has forced me to face some uncomfortable truths about the past that I'd rather have continued ignoring. The sheriff's acknowledgement of his changed perspective reflected broader shifts in white community attitudes that were occurring as the treasure recovery revealed specific details about slavery's brutality that were harder to dismiss or romanticize than abstract historical narratives. The documents and artifacts emerging from Morrison's caches provided concrete evidence of individual suffering and injustice that personalized slavery's impact in ways that statistical summaries or academic discussions could never achieve. The cooperation that emerged during hurricane recovery and treasure excavation created momentum for addressing the legal and political challenges that had threatened to derail Rebecca's community-based approach. Federal authorities who had been investigating white supremacist threats recognized that the changed community dynamics offered opportunities for resolving the controversy through negotiation rather than confrontation. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos, who had been coordinating the federal response to domestic terrorism threats, arranged a series of mediated discussions between Rebecca, her family challengers, community representatives, and government officials. The sessions took place in Jackson under strict security protocols that prevented disruption by extremist groups while ensuring that all legitimate stakeholders had opportunities to present their positions and concerns. The mediation process revealed that even Bradley Morrison Whitfield's opposition to Rebecca's project was motivated partly by genuine confusion about legal and moral issues, rather than pure greed or racial animosity. His aggressive tactics had been influenced by advice from Confederate heritage organizations that portrayed any acknowledgement of slavery's injustices as attacks on Southern culture and white identity. I never intended for this situation to become violent or dangerous, Bradley admitted during one particularly frank discussion session. I genuinely believed that Rebecca was being manipulated by outside agitators who wanted to use our family's history for their own political purposes. But seeing the actual documents and artifacts that have been recovered, and learning about what really happened to the people who were forced to bury this treasure, has made me realize that I was defending something that shouldn't be defended. Bradley's change of perspective was influenced partly by his own research into Morrison family history that had been prompted by the treasure discovery. He had discovered documents in family papers that revealed the extent of General Morrison's involvement in slavery and wartime atrocities. Information that his family had either never known or had deliberately suppressed in favor of more comfortable narratives about Confederate heroism and Southern honor. The mediated discussions resulted in a comprehensive agreement that addressed the concerns of all parties while establishing precedents for how similar historical reparations projects might be structured in the future. Rebecca retained primary authority over treasure distribution decisions, but Bradley and other Morrison descendants received recognition as family historians whose cooperation would be essential for documenting the full scope of the treasure and its historical significance. Most importantly, the agreement established a community foundation governed by representatives from both white and African American families with historical connections to Willowbrook Plantation. The foundation would oversee the distribution of recovered treasure according to principles that prioritized addressing historical injustices while also supporting broader community development projects that would benefit all residents regardless of racial background. The foundation's structure reflected lessons learned during months of community consultation about the importance of local control and democratic participation in reparations processes. Rather than simply transferring wealth from white to black hands, the agreement created institutional mechanisms for ongoing cooperation and shared decision-making that could address contemporary problems while healing historical divisions. Satu, first major distribution from the recovered treasure, went to establishing an educational scholarship fund specifically for descendants of families that had been enslaved at Willowbrook and other area plantations. The scholarships would cover not only college tuition, but also vocational training, graduate education, and professional development programs designed to address the educational disparities that had persisted as a legacy of slavery and segregation. Additional funds were allocated for community health initiatives, small business development programs, and infrastructure improvements that would benefit the entire county while prioritizing areas where African American families had been excluded from previous public investment. The distribution plan emphasized sustainable approaches that would create lasting change rather than one-time payments that might provide temporary relief without addressing systemic inequalities. The hurricane that had initially seemed like another obstacle to the treasure project ultimately became the catalyst for achieving the community cooperation and healing that Rebecca had envisioned from the beginning. The shared experience of natural disaster and recovery had demonstrated that racial divisions were artificial barriers that could be overcome when people focused on common challenges and mutual interdependence. As winter settled over Mississippi, and the immediate crisis of the treasure controversy gave way to the sustained work of implementation and distribution, Rebecca realized that the hurricane had provided something more valuable than the gold and silver that lay buried in Morrison's carefully marked locations. It had created the conditions for genuine community transformation that could serve as a model for addressing historical injustices throughout the American South. The storm had washed away more than topsoil and debris. It had cleared the ground for new relationships and shared commitments that could withstand the pressures and challenges that would inevitably arise as the community continued working to build a more just and equitable future. 10 years later, on a crisp November morning in 2005, Becca Morrison stood before a gathering of over 300 people assembled on the grounds of what had once been Willowbrook Plantation. The occasion was the dedication of the Morrison Washington Community Heritage Center, a museum and educational facility that had risen from the success of the Treasure Recovery Project and now served as a national model for community-based approaches to historical reconciliation and reparations. The crowd gathered for the dedication ceremony reflected the profound transformation that had occurred in Magnolia County since that hurricane-soaked day when Marcus had first discovered Morrison's hidden wealth. African American and white families sat together on folding chairs arranged beneath a canopy of ancient live oak trees, their children playing together in integrated groups that would have been unimaginable during the tense confrontations of 1995. Rebecca, now 52, and bearing the confident bearing of someone who had successfully navigated one of the most complex moral challenges of her generation, served as the ceremony's keynote speaker. Her remarks would be broadcast live on C-SPAN, and later excerpted in documentaries about American reparations efforts, but her focus remained on the local community members whose courage and persistence had made the transformation possible. When I first arrived in Mississippi 10 years ago, Rebecca began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, I thought I was simply settling an inheritance and returning to Chicago. I had no idea that opening a desk drawer would lead to opening conversations about justice, healing, and the possibility of redemption that this community had been waiting generations to have. The Heritage Center itself embodied the principles that had guided the treasure distribution process from its earliest stages. The facility had been designed and built through partnerships between African American and white contractors, architects, and craftspeople, creating employment opportunities while ensuring that the project reflected the aesthetic and cultural values of all community stakeholders. The center's exhibits told the complete story of Willowbrook Plantation from its establishment in the 1840s through its role in the contemporary reparations project. Visitors could learn about the daily lives of enslaved families, the economic systems that had supported plantation agriculture, and the long-term impacts of slavery on subsequent generations of both African American and white residents. But the center's most powerful exhibit was the treasure vault itself, where examples of Morrison's recovered gold and silver were displayed alongside the documents that revealed how the wealth had been accumulated and concealed. Interactive displays allowed visitors to explore the moral questions that Rebecca and the community had grappled with, encouraging reflection on how historical injustices continued to shape contemporary society. Marcus, now 27 and serving as the Heritage Center's first executive director, had grown into the kind of leader that his mother had hoped he would become during those challenging years when his character was being shaped by exposure to complex moral decisions. His education at Tuskegee University had been funded by the scholarship program established with treasure proceeds, and he had returned to Magnolia County with degrees in history and museum studies that prepared him to carry forward the community reconciliation work that had begun with his mother's discovery. My son has become living proof that addressing historical injustices creates opportunities rather than limitations, Rebecca observed, watching Marcus coordinate with audio-visual technicians preparing to record the ceremony. He grew up understanding that moral courage sometimes requires sacrifice, but he also learned that doing the right thing opens doors to possibilities that purely selfish choices could never provide. The success of the Magnolia County reparations project had attracted national attention that extended far beyond academic and policy circles. The community foundation established to oversee treasure distribution had leveraged the initial recovery into ongoing fundraising and development efforts that had brought millions of additional dollars in federal grants, private donations, and corporate partnerships to support education, healthcare, and economic development initiatives. The scholarship program alone had enabled over 200 young people to pursue higher education, with graduates now working as teachers, nurses, engineers, attorneys, and business owners throughout Mississippi and beyond. Many had returned to Magnolia County to contribute their skills to ongoing community development efforts, creating a virtuous cycle of investment and improvement that was transforming the county's economic prospects. Mrs. Josephine Turner, now 93 and serving as the Heritage Center's honorary chairwoman, represented the direct link between the slavery era and contemporary healing efforts. Her great-grandmother Sarah's story had become central to the center's educational programming, personalizing the abstract concepts of historical injustice and reparations in ways that helped visitors understand the human dimensions of both slavery and its ongoing legacy. Sarah never lived to see her children again after Master Morrison sold her away, Mrs. Turner said during her remarks at the dedication ceremony, her voice still strong despite her advanced age. But she would be proud to know that her great-great-grandchildren are now doctors and teachers and business owners, educated with money that came from the same gold she was forced to help bury over a century ago. Sometimes justice takes a long time, but it can still arrive if people have the courage to demand it. The community health initiatives funded by treasure proceeds had addressed medical disparities that had persisted since the end of slavery, establishing clinics in underserved areas and providing preventive care that had measurably improved health outcomes for both African American and white residents. The small business development programs had created over 300 new enterprises, many of them partnerships between entrepreneurs from different racial backgrounds who had discovered shared interests and complementary skills. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the Treasure Project was its influence on how other communities throughout the South were addressing questions of historical memory and contemporary responsibility. Delegations from Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and other states had visited Magnolia County to study the reparations model, and several had established their own initiatives based on the principles and practices that Rebecca and her community partners had developed. The Heritage Center had become a destination for scholars, policymakers, and community activists seeking to understand how local initiatives could address historical injustices in ways that built bridges rather than deepening divisions. University research programs were documenting the project's outcomes and developing curricula that would help other communities navigate similar moral and practical challenges. Reverend Washington, now 74 and still serving as Mount Olive Baptist Church's pastor, had emerged as a national spokesperson for community-based approaches to racial reconciliation. His partnership with Rebecca had demonstrated that authentic cooperation between white and African American leaders was possible when based on mutual respect, shared commitment to justice, and willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable historical truths. What we accomplished here didn't happen because we found buried treasure, Reverend Washington explained to visitors who came seeking simple formulas for replicating Magnolia County's success. It happened because Sister Rebecca had the moral courage to do what was right even when it was difficult and costly, and because our community was ready to work together instead of letting outside agitators divide us. The treasure was just the catalyst. The real change came from people choosing to trust each other and work toward shared goals. The dedication ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a memorial garden honoring all the enslaved people who had lived and worked at Willowbrook Plantation. The garden featured native Mississippi plants arranged in patterns that reflected traditional African agricultural techniques, creating a space for reflection and remembrance that acknowledged suffering, while celebrating survival and resilience. Anthony Washington, now serving as a federal judge in the Southern District of Mississippi, delivered the dedication's closing remarks. His appointment to the federal bench had been supported by both African American civil rights organizations and white legal establishments that recognized his exceptional qualifications and his role in demonstrating that racial cooperation could produce leaders capable of serving the entire community with distinction. This memorial garden represents more than historical acknowledgement, Judge Washington observed. It represents our commitment to ensuring that the injustices of the past do not continue into the future. Every plant that grows here, every student who receives a scholarship, every family that benefits from improved health care or economic opportunity represents a victory for the principles of justice and human dignity that should guide all our community decisions. As the ceremony ended and visitors began touring the Heritage Center's exhibits, Rebecca found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from reluctant inheritor to community transformation leader. The woman who had arrived in Mississippi, expecting to quickly settle an estate and return to Chicago, had instead discovered a calling that had defined the most meaningful years of her life. The financial sacrifice that had seemed so daunting in 1995 had ultimately created opportunities and relationships that were far more valuable than any treasure Morrison could have buried. Her decision to choose moral principle over material advantage had generated returns that compound annually through the lives of young people educated with scholarship funds, families lifted out of poverty through business development programs, and communities healed through the patient work of building trust across racial lines. But Rebecca's greatest satisfaction came from observing Marcus as he guided visitors through the Heritage Center, explaining complex historical and moral concepts. With the same combination of intellectual rigor and emotional intelligence that had characterized the community consultation process from its earliest stages. Her son had grown into exactly the kind of leader that America needed to address its ongoing struggles with racial inequality and historical injustice. As the sun set over the Mississippi Delta, casting long shadows across the Heritage Center, grounds where Confederate treasure had been transformed into tools for justice and healing, Rebecca understood that her story was far from finished. The principles and practices developed in Magnolia County were being replicated throughout the South and beyond, creating a movement for community-based reparations that could influence American race relations for generations to come. The treasure map that had initially seemed like a solution to personal financial problems had become instead a blueprint for social transformation that demonstrated the power of individual moral courage to create collective change. Morrison's carefully hidden gold had been transformed from a symbol of historical oppression into a foundation for contemporary liberation, proving that even the darkest chapters of American history could be redeemed through sustained commitment to justice and reconciliation. If this incredible story of courage and transformation has inspired you, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell us what part of Rebecca's journey resonated most with you, and share how you think communities today can work together to address historical injustices. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our amazing stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Tomorrow we've got another incredible tale that will show you how one person's decision to do the right thing can change everything. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. And if you enjoyed this story, check out our playlist of inspiring historical tales that prove courage and compassion can triumph over hatred and division. These are the stories that remind us what's possible when we choose to build bridges instead of walls. Thanks for joining us on this remarkable journey through one of the most extraordinary acts of moral courage in modern American history. Until next time, keep believing that each of us has the power to make a difference.